The Johnson family had been looking forward to their summer vacation for months. Life in the busy city often left them tired and drained, so when the school year ended and Mr. Johnson managed to take a week off from work, they all agreed it was the perfect time for a trip. They packed their SUV with bright beach towels, a cooler full of sandwiches, sunscreen, and the kids' favorite games. The trunk overflowed with excitement as much as it did with luggage. Mr. Johnson was a tall man with a calm smile. Known by his children as both protective and playful, Mrs. Johnson was the heart of the family, always making sure no one forgot snacks, water bottles, or the extra hats she insisted they'd need. Their two kids, Maya and Jordan, couldn't stop talking about building sandcastles and splashing in the ocean. The car echoed with laughter, music, and the happy sound of siblings teasing one another. The family's destination was a small coastal town a few hours away. It was not as famous as big beaches, but that was exactly why they chose it. Quiet streets, friendly shops, and an uncrowded shoreline promised peace. The Johnsons wanted to escape the noise of the city and enjoy days filled with sunshine and salt air. As they drove, the children pressed their faces to the windows, pointing at cows in fields and waving at passing cars. Mrs. Johnson hummed softly along with the radio, while Mr. Johnson kept one hand steady on the wheel. He smiled at the sight of his family happy together, feeling the kind of warmth that no job or money could buy. The trip was not just about rest, it was about connection, about building memories that would last long after summer ended. After a few hours on the road, the SUV began to run low on gas. "Let's stop here," Mr. Johnson said as he pulled into a small-town gas station. The sign was faded and the pumps looked older, but the smell of the ocean was already drifting into the air. The kids cheered, glad for the chance to stretch their legs and grab snacks. Inside the gas station, the cool blast of air conditioning greeted them. Rows of candy, chips, and sodas lined the aisles, and Maya ran straight to the slushy machine while Jordan grabbed a bag of gummy worms. Mrs. Johnson browsed the coolers for bottled water, smiling at how ordinary yet perfect the moment was. For them, even this stop felt like part of the adventure. Mr. Johnson stayed by the pump outside, filling the car while humming a tune. He wore simple jeans and a polo shirt, nothing flashy, nothing unusual. His mind was on the road ahead, the beach waiting for them, the joy of watching his children build castles in the sand. He had no reason to expect trouble, no reason to feel anything but peace. But in the corner of the lot sat a police cruiser. Two officers inside were watching, their eyes narrowing as the Johnson family moved around the station. To any fair observer, it was a scene of normal vacation joy, but through the lens of prejudice, it became something else, something twisted. The officers muttered between themselves, their gaze fixed not on behavior but on skin color. Inside the store, Jordan dropped his candy on the counter with a grin, telling the cashier, "We're going to the beach." The cashier smiled politely, but the door chimed again as one of the officers stepped inside, his boots heavy against the floor. Maya tugged on her mother's sleeve, her smile faltering. She didn't know why, but she felt the air shift. Turning colder, Mrs. Johnson noticed too, her hand instinctively resting on her daughter's shoulder. Outside, Mr. Johnson finished pumping gas and tightened the cap. He glanced at the cruiser, noticing the other officer now stepping out. His posture stiff, Mr. Johnson's instincts sharpened, the kind that never truly left him no matter how much he tried to relax. Though he was on vacation, he was still a man trained to notice tension, to sense danger before it fully arrived. But for the sake of his children, he pushed the thought aside. He wanted this trip to be about joy, not suspicion. The Johnson family regrouped at the car, snacks in hand, laughter bubbling again. They didn't realize they were no longer alone in their moment. The officers had already judged them, not by what they had done, but by what they looked like. And while the Johnsons prepared to continue their happy journey, the shadow of injustice was already moving closer. Yet, as the ocean breeze brushed through the air and the car doors swung open, Jamal, young and wide-eyed, still believed nothing could ruin their family trip. He looked at his father with admiration, at his mother with love, and at his sister with playful joy. The road stretched ahead, glowing with promise. But behind the glow waited a storm, one that would test their strength and reveal truths none of them expected. The Johnson family stepped back into the warm afternoon air, their arms full of snacks and drinks. The SUV gleamed under the sun. Already packed for their beach getaway, Mr. Johnson loaded the last items into the cooler in the trunk. While Mrs. Johnson handed bottles of water to Maya and Jordan, the children's laughter rang across the lot as they argued playfully about who got the bigger bag of chips. It was a simple family moment, innocent and ordinary, but only a few yards away. The two officers leaned against their cruiser, their eyes fixed on the Johnsons. Their voices were low, but their tone carried judgment. "Out-of-towners," one officer muttered. "Don't look like they belong here," the other nodded, his gaze sharp. "Let's check it out, better to be safe." Safe, however, was not what they were after, suspicion was. Mr. Johnson noticed them approaching, his instincts sharpening the way they always did when something felt off. He straightened slightly, his body calm but alert. Mrs. Johnson also sensed the shift, her hand gently squeezing Maya's as the girl tried to sip her slushie without spilling. The family had come for rest, but the storm of prejudice was already rolling in. "Excuse me," one officer called out as he neared the car. His voice was not friendly, it was clipped, heavy with authority. Mr. Johnson turned politely. "Yes, officer, can I help you?" he asked. The officer's eyes narrowed, sweeping over the family as if searching for fault. "You folks from around here?" he asked sharply. Mr. Johnson kept his voice steady. "We're visiting, just on vacation with the family." The other officer joined in, folding his arms across his chest. "Vacation, huh? Where exactly are you headed?" he demanded. The tone was not casual curiosity. It was an interrogation. Mrs. Johnson frowned, her protective instincts flaring as Jordan stepped closer to her side. Mr. Johnson remained calm, though his patience was tested. "We're driving to the coast just here to enjoy the beach," he replied evenly. But the first officer shook his head slightly, his suspicion deepening instead of fading. "You got ID on you?" he asked suddenly. "Driver's license, registration, maybe proof of where you're coming from?" The request came out not as a question, but as a demand. Mrs. Johnson's lips parted in shock. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked. The shorter one smirked faintly. "Just a routine check, ma'am. People passing through sometimes cause trouble. We like to make sure everything's in order." The words "people passing through" hung in the air like poison. It wasn't about crime or safety. It was about who the Johnsons were and the color of their skin. Jamal, young and observant, felt his stomach tighten. He looked at his father, wondering why the officers treated them so differently than the other travelers he had seen. He wanted to ask, but stayed quiet, sensing this was not the time. His father's calm voice broke the silence. "I'll get my license for you," Mr. Johnson said. Reaching carefully into his wallet, moving with deliberate slowness, he knew sudden movements could be twisted into excuses for aggression. He handed over the license, his face steady, his posture respectful. But respect was not returned, only more suspicion. The officer studied the card as though searching for something wrong. Meanwhile, the second officer circled the car, peering through the windows, glancing at the luggage as though it might reveal hidden crimes. Mrs. Johnson held her children tighter, whispering softly, "It's okay. Just stay calm." The kids could feel the tension, though they didn't understand all of it. Why were their parents being questioned for stopping at a gas station? Why were they treated like strangers in a country that was supposed to be their home? The innocent joy of the trip was beginning to slip away, replaced by unease. When the officer finally looked up from the license, his expression was still hard. "Mind if we ask you to step aside, sir?" he said, his tone leaving no room for refusal. Mrs. Johnson's heart raced, her eyes widening in fear. Is that really necessary? "The kids," she began, but the officer cut her off. "Ma'am, let us do our job if he's got nothing to hide." "This will be quick." Mr. Johnson's jaw tightened, but he nodded calmly. "All right, but my children will stay with their mother," he said firmly. He kissed Maya on the forehead, patted Jordan's shoulder, and gave his wife a look of reassurance, though he stayed outwardly calm. Inside, he felt the sting of injustice rising. He had dealt with difficult situations before, but never like this, not in front of his children. As he stepped aside with the officers, The children clung to their mother, watching with wide, worried eyes. They could not understand why their father, the man they admired most, was suddenly being treated like a suspect. And while the beach still waited in the distance, its promise of fun and freedom seemed far away. The Johnson family had come for peace, but now stood in the shadow of trouble, a shadow cast not by their actions, but by prejudice. Mr. Johnson stood calmly beside the SUV, the summer sun hot on his back. The two officers positioned themselves in front of him, their stance rigid, their hands resting near their belts. Mrs. Johnson held Maya and Jordan close, her heart pounding as she tried to stay steady for her children. The gas station, once filled with the laughter of a family on vacation, now felt heavy with suspicion. The taller officer began, his voice sharp and commanding. "Where exactly are you coming from?" he asked, leaning in as though expecting a lie. Mr. Johnson answered clearly, "We're driving down from the city, just stopping for gas and snacks on our way to the beach." His tone was polite, his words simple, but the officer's eyes narrowed even more. "And why this beach? Why this town? You folks don't live here," the officer pressed. Mrs. Johnson felt anger rising inside her chest. "We're just on vacation, officer. Isn't that allowed?" she asked, her voice steady, though her hands trembled as she squeezed Maya's shoulder. The shorter officer smirked faintly, shaking his head. "Funny. We don't usually get families like yours around here. People usually drive to the bigger resorts," he said, his tone dripping with implication. The children looked between the adults, sensing something cruel hidden in the words but not fully understanding. Jordan whispered to his sister, "Why are they asking so many questions?" "We didn't do anything." Maya shook her head, clutching her slushy cup tightly as if it were a shield. Mrs. Johnson leaned down, whispering softly, "It's okay. Stay close to me." But her own voice carried the edge of fear. The taller officer leaned closer to Mr. Johnson. "You got proof of your vacation plans? Hotel reservations? Maybe receipts?" he asked. The question itself felt absurd, but it was delivered like an accusation. Mr. Johnson drew a slow breath, steadying himself. "With respect, officer, we're just a family on the road. Do you ask every tourist for their receipts?" he said. The officer's jaw tightened. "Don't get smart with me, sir. I asked a question." The tension grew sharper. Slicing through the air like a knife, Mrs. Johnson stepped forward. Unable to stay silent, he answered your questions. "We're not hiding anything. We're just here with our kids," she said firmly. But the shorter officer turned to her, his eyes cold. "Ma'am, let your husband handle this. You don't want to escalate the situation?" Her mouth fell open in shock, her voice caught between anger and fear. "Escalate?" she thought. "They're the ones making this into something, not us." The children's eyes filled with worry, watching as their parents stood surrounded by authority figures who seemed determined to find guilt where none existed. Every question felt less like curiosity and more like a trap. The taller officer pointed at the luggage visible through the SUV windows. "What's in those bags?" he demanded. "Clothes, swimsuits, the usual things you bring on a beach trip," Mr. Johnson replied, his voice calm but clipped. "We'll need to take a look," the officer said flatly. Mrs. Johnson gasped. "What? You can't just search through our things." "We haven't done anything wrong." The shorter officer took a step closer, his hand brushing against his holster. "Ma'am! Don't make this harder than it has to be. We're just asking questions," he said. Though his tone made it sound more like a threat than a reassurance, Mr. Johnson's face remained calm, but his eyes were sharp. Inside, his patience was thinning, but he knew showing anger would only make them dig deeper. He glanced at his children, saw the fear in their eyes, and reminded himself he had to stay composed. The officers kept circling with their words, pressing questions again and again. "Why this route? Why this small station instead of the bigger one down the highway? Why did you take so long inside?" Each question chipped away at the family's peace, as if enjoying snacks and filling gas had turned into crimes. Mr. Johnson answered each one with steady calm, his voice never rising. He knew these men weren't seeking truth. They were searching for excuses. But he also knew something they didn't, that their unfair questions would soon lead them into a mistake bigger than they could imagine. Maya tugged on her mother's arm, whispering, "Mom, are they going to take Daddy away?" Mrs. Johnson bent low, holding her daughter's face in her hands. "No, baby. Your daddy hasn't done anything wrong." But as she said the words, her eyes filled with a flicker of doubt, because the way the officers moved, the way they spoke, suggested that they were not after justice but after control. Mr. Johnson looked from one officer to the other, his voice calm but firm. "I've answered your questions, officer. My family and I would like to continue our trip now," he said. The taller one shook his head, a shadow crossing his face. "Not yet, sir." "Not until we're satisfied," he said. The meaning behind his words was clear. This was no longer about questions. This was about power. The Johnsons had come to the gas station for nothing more than fuel and snacks. But now they stood in the middle of something far more dangerous. The questions weren't about curiosity. They were about control, suspicion, and prejudice. And as the officers circled, their voices sharp and accusing, the Johnson family's peaceful vacation began to unravel under the weight of unfair questions. The gas station lot grew quieter as the questioning dragged on. A few customers lingered near their cars, pretending to pump gas or check tires. But really watching the scene unfold, phones began to rise in subtle hands, screens glowing as bystanders started recording. Everyone could feel the tension in the air, thick and uncomfortable like a storm about to break. Mr. Johnson stood tall, his posture calm, his voice steady, but inside, his patience was thinning. He had answered every question, explained every detail, and still the officers pressed harder. They weren't looking for truth, they were looking for control. And when control was their goal, fairness was forgotten. The taller officer stepped closer, his shadow falling across Mr. Johnson. "All right, sir. We're going to need you to step away from the vehicle," he ordered. Mr. Johnson blinked, his tone measured. "I've given you everything you asked for. License, explanation, cooperation. What reason do you have to pull me aside?" The officer's jaw tightened. "Your attitude seems defensive. That's reason enough," he snapped. Mrs. Johnson gasped, her voice sharp now. "Defensive?" "He's been nothing but calm. You're pushing this for no reason." The shorter officer turned toward her, his eyes cold. "Ma'am, let us do our job." "You don't want to interfere," he said, his hand resting lightly on his belt. Maya clung to her mother's waist, whispering, "Mom, I'm scared!" Jordan's small fists clenched at his sides, anger mixing with confusion. Mr. Johnson raised his hands slightly, palms open, a universal gesture of peace. "All right," he said, his voice deep but calm. "I'll step aside, but my family stays here. You won't frighten them more than you already have." He moved slowly, deliberately, making sure every step was clear. His training, his discipline guided him, though the officers had no idea who they were dealing with. The taller officer grabbed his arm roughly, twisting it behind his back. "Hands behind your back!" he barked, pulling out his cuffs. Gasps rippled through the small crowd as the metallic click echoed in the air. Mrs. Johnson shouted, "Stop! You can't do this! He hasn't done anything!" Her voice cracked with fury. But the officers ignored her. The children screamed, rushing forward until their mother held them back with trembling arms. Mr. Johnson winced but kept his voice controlled. "This is unnecessary," he said firmly. "You're making a mistake," the shorter officer sneered. "If you've got nothing to hide, you'll have nothing to worry about." But his words rang hollow, because everyone watching knew this wasn't about crime. It was about color. The cuffs tightened around Mr. Johnson's wrists, the sun glinting off the cold steel. Mrs. Johnson's heart pounded as she saw her husband, the man who was always their protector, treated like a criminal before his children. She shouted again, her voice breaking, "Our kids are watching. Stop this. Stop it now." But the officers pushed Mr. Johnson toward their cruiser, their movements harsh and unyielding. Tears streamed down Maya's cheeks as she cried, "Daddy!" Jordan stomped his foot, yelling, "Let him go!" He didn't do anything. The sound of their young voices pierced the onlookers' hearts, some of whom lowered their phones in shame. Unable to film a family's pain any longer, others held their cameras higher, determined to capture every moment of injustice. Through it all, Mr. Johnson's composure never cracked. He stood as tall as the cuffs allowed, his shoulders straight, his voice calm. "Stay strong, kids. It's going to be all right," he called out. His tone was so steady, so sure, that even in their tears, the children clung to his words like lifelines. Mrs. Johnson's fury blazed. "This is racial profiling, pure and simple," she shouted at the officers, her voice fierce enough to make the bystanders nod in agreement. The taller officer glared at her. "Ma'am, back away before you make this worse for yourself." But Mrs. Johnson did not back down. She wrapped her arms around her children and held her ground. She would not let fear silence her. The officers shoved Mr. Johnson toward the open cruiser door. The sound of the cuffs rattling was sharp, final. The shorter one muttered, "Suspicious behavior, resisting questions? Looks like probable cause to me." But the words carried no truth. Only the thin veil of authority used to cover injustice. The bystanders murmured louder now, some calling out, "He didn't do anything." One woman shouted, "Let him go!" while another man muttered, "This is wrong." The officers ignored them. Their pride locked in, their decision already made. They thought they had control, thought they had the power. But what they didn't know was that the man they had just handcuffed was no ordinary father. Mr. Johnson's badge was still tucked inside his wallet. Hidden in his back pocket, the very badge that represented federal authority, years of service and a life dedicated to justice. And while the officers dragged him toward their car, convinced of their power, they had no idea that their own actions were about to turn against them. No idea that the truth they had ignored would soon rise and expose them in front of everyone. The Johnson family's vacation had shifted into something darker, something unforgettable. What was meant to be a week of rest by the sea had become a moment of humiliation in a small-town gas station, and though fear gripped them, though tears fell freely, the family's dignity still burned bright, because deep inside, Mr. Johnson knew the truth. Justice would find its way. And when it did, the officers would regret every move they had made. The moment the cold cuffs clicked around Mr. Johnson's wrists, the world seemed to freeze. The children's laughter from earlier that day felt like a distant memory. Replaced by cries of fear and confusion, Mrs. Johnson's voice rose above the noise. Trembling with both anger and desperation, "You can't do this. He hasn't done anything wrong," she cried, clutching her children to her side. But the officers paid no attention, their faces hard with pride. The taller officer gripped Mr. Johnson's arm, forcing him toward the cruiser. "Sir, you're under arrest for suspicious behavior and failure to cooperate," he said coldly. The words stung not because they held truth, but because they carried the weight of injustice. Mr. Johnson's calm voice broke through. Steady even as his hands were bound, "I cooperated fully." "You're making a mistake," he said, his tone unwavering. The shorter officer stepped closer to Mrs. Johnson, raising his hand in warning. "Ma'am, step back, don't interfere, or we'll have to take you in too," he warned. The children gasped, clinging tighter to their mother. Maya's small voice shook as she cried. "Please don't take Daddy," Jordan shouted angrily. "He didn't do anything," his young fists clenched in helpless rage. The sight of a father being dragged in cuffs while his children screamed tore at the hearts of bystanders. Some muttered angrily, some whispered in disbelief, and others recorded every second on their phones. A woman near the pumps shook her head, saying softly, "This is wrong. Everyone can see it." But the officers ignored the voices, too caught up in their authority to notice the crowd turning against them. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward despite the warning, her voice sharp and clear. "My husband is innocent, and you will regret this. You're humiliating him in front of his children," she said firmly. Her strength came not from anger alone, but from love and the need to protect her family. But her words only made the taller officer grip Mr. Johnson's arm harder. "Enough!" he snapped, shoving him closer to the cruiser. Mr. Johnson stumbled, but quickly regained his footing. He looked back at his family, his eyes filled with calm reassurance. "Stay strong," he called to them. "Everything will be all right. Trust me," his voice carried power. Not just for his children, but for everyone watching. Even in chains, he carried dignity. The children's cries grew louder as their father was pushed toward the back seat of the cruiser. Maya covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Jordan tried to pull away from his mother's grasp, shouting, "I'll stop them, Mom! I'll stop them!" But Mrs. Johnson pulled him close, whispering, "No, baby, stay with me. Your father will handle this." Her own tears burned, but she refused to let them see her break as Mr. Johnson was shoved against the car. The shorter officer patted him down roughly. The search was invasive and harsh, as if they were determined to find something that wasn't there. Empty pockets, wallet? Phone! The officer barked. Mr. Johnson remained calm, though each shove pressed deeper into the wound of injustice. He knew patience was his strongest weapon in this moment. The taller officer opened the cruiser door, ready to force him inside, but before stepping in, Mr. Johnson turned his head toward the gathering crowd. He locked eyes with his children once more, his steady voice rising above the noise. "I'll be okay," he said, his calmness a shield against the chaos. The words wrapped around Maya and Jordan like a promise. Even as their tears continued to fall inside the gas station, the cashier whispered to another customer. "He didn't do anything." "This is going to blow up on them," a man holding his phone muttered. "It's all on video. The world will see this." The officers, however, continued their charade of authority, blind to the truth closing in on them. They believed they had control, believed their power was absolute. But the truth was waiting, ready to surface. Mrs. Johnson stepped closer once again, her voice cutting through the tension. "You think you've arrested some ordinary man, but you don't know who he is," she said firmly. Her chin high, the officers exchanged a glance, their arrogance preventing them from considering her words seriously. "Doesn't matter who he is," the taller one muttered. "Right now. He's in our custody." But Mrs. Johnson's words carried more weight than they realized. The children pressed against her sides, their small faces buried in her arms. She held them tightly, whispering, "Your father is strong, stronger than they know, and soon they'll see it too." Her voice, though quiet, was laced with certainty. Because she knew the truth. She knew the man they had handcuffed was far more than just her husband. He was a federal agent, a man of justice, a man who knew how to stand tall in the face of corruption. The cruiser door slammed shut, the sound echoing like thunder across the lot. The crowd flinched, the children cried harder, and Mrs. Johnson stood frozen in defiance to the officers. It seemed like the end of the confrontation, but in reality, it was only the beginning because soon, their arrogance would shatter under the weight of the revelation waiting in Mr. Johnson's wallet. And when that moment came, the same cuffs that now bit into his wrists would turn into symbols of shame for the ones who put them there. The Johnson family's vacation had been scarred, but it would not end in defeat, for truth was stronger than prejudice, and dignity was stronger than power abused. And though the children saw their father taken, they would also see him rise, a father, a protector, and above all, a man who carried justice in his very name. The cruiser door slammed shut with a heavy thud. The sound echoed across the lot like a final blow, sealing the injustice for everyone watching. Maya and Jordan pressed their faces against their mother's arms, their sobs muffled but painful. Mrs. Johnson stroked their backs, whispering, "Hold on, babies. Just hold on." Her eyes never left her husband, her mind racing, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and certainty. Inside the cruiser, Mr. Johnson sat upright, his hands still cuffed tightly behind him, the leather seat pressed cold against his back. But his expression remained calm. He knew panic would only feed their arrogance. Instead, he breathed slowly, his sharp mind working like it always did. He had faced criminals, liars, and dangerous situations, yet here he was, being treated as a suspect for nothing more than the color of his skin. The taller officer leaned down near the open door, his voice dripping with false confidence. "You're not going anywhere until we're finished with you," he said. Mr. Johnson met his gaze, his own voice calm and measured. "You're already finished, officer, you just don't realize it yet." The man frowned, confused but shrugged it off, thinking he had the upper hand. The shorter officer opened Mr. Johnson's wallet roughly, pulling out the contents as part of their so-called search. He flipped through credit cards, cash, and finally froze as his eyes landed on something he never expected. A shiny badge, heavy and unmistakable, stared back at him from the leather holder. The 3 bold letters glimmered in the afternoon sun, FBI. The officer's mouth went dry, his hand trembling as he turned it toward his partner. The taller officer's face drained of color as soon as he saw it. He snatched the badge from his partner's hand, flipping it open again and again as if hoping it wasn't real. But it was real, undeniable, unshakable. The very man they had humiliated in front of his children was a federal agent. Not just a man with rights, but a man with authority far greater than theirs. Mr. Johnson leaned slightly forward, his voice calm but sharp like a blade. "Now you know who I am," he said, his eyes locked onto theirs. Not with fear, but with unbreakable strength. "You profiled me, you humiliated me in front of my family, and you placed me in cuffs without cause. Every second of this is an abuse of power, and you will answer for it," the shorter officer stuttered. We didn't know, sir. We thought—" Mr. Johnson cut him off, his voice firm. "You thought wrong. You didn't see a father on vacation. You didn't see a man with his children. You saw only what your prejudice told you to see, and you acted on it." His words cut deeper than any weapon, each one laced with truth. The taller officer swallowed hard, unable to form a defense. Outside, Mrs. Johnson watched the officers' faces shift from arrogance to fear. She couldn't hear every word, but she saw the moment their pride collapsed. Her heart pounded with relief, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. She whispered to her children, "Look, Daddy's showing them who he really is." The kids peeked through tearful eyes, confusion mixing with sudden hope. The taller officer quickly unlocked the cuffs, his hands fumbling. I apologize, sir. There must have been a misunderstanding," he muttered. The cuffs fell away, clattering against the metal frame of the cruiser. Mr. Johnson flexed his wrists, the red marks left behind glowing like evidence of their mistake. He stepped out slowly, his posture tall, his presence commanding. The crowd erupted in murmurs as the badge was revealed. Phones captured every second, recording the fall of two officers who had let prejudice blind them. Some onlookers clapped softly, others shook their heads. Disgusted at the officers' actions, the truth had surfaced. Undeniable, unstoppable, and in that moment, the Johnson family's dignity began to shine brighter than the injustice they had faced. Mr. Johnson turned to face the officers fully, his voice carrying like a hammer on steel. "You will apologize to my wife and children right now," he ordered. The officers stiffened, their pride resisting. But the weight of the badge and the eyes of the crowd left them no choice. The shorter one stepped forward, his voice shaky. We're sorry, ma'am, kids. We made a mistake," but their words were hollow. Falling flat against the pain they had caused, Mrs. Johnson straightened her shoulders. Her arms still wrapped around her children. Her eyes burned as she answered. "A mistake is forgetting your keys. This was not a mistake. This was discrimination." The taller officer's face reddened. Shame washing over him, he opened his mouth, but no excuse could undo what had been done. The truth was out, and the truth was enough. Mr. Johnson stood beside his family once more, his presence shielding them from the weight of the moment. He leaned down to his children, brushing their hair back gently. "See? Daddy's all right, nothing to be afraid of," he whispered. Their tears slowed, replaced with small but brave nods. They had seen their father dragged in cuffs, but they had also seen him rise, stronger than the ones who tried to bring him down. As the family regrouped, the officers stood frozen, their authority stripped bare. They had thought they were in control, but now they were the ones trapped in the evidence of their own prejudice. The crowd's phones kept recording, each second sealing their downfall, and the Johnson family, though shaken, stood tall in dignity, because the revelation had come, and with it, the balance of power had shifted completely. The lot had fallen silent except for the low hum of cars passing on the highway. The officers stood frozen, their arrogance stripped away, the FBI badge still burning in their minds. Around them, the small crowd of bystanders remained, phones raised, whispers running like ripples across water. Everyone had witnessed the injustice, and now they waited to see what the father would do. Mr. Johnson rubbed his wrists where the cuffs had left red marks. The pain didn't bother him as much as the sight of his children still clutching their mother. He turned first to Maya and Jordan, crouching down so his eyes met theirs. "You see?" he whispered softly. "Daddy's okay. You don't have to be scared anymore." The children nodded through lingering tears. Their faces filled with both relief and pride. Then Mr. Johnson rose to his full height, his presence towering over the scene. He faced the two officers, his voice calm yet sharp, carrying the weight of authority and truth. You treated my family like criminals when all we did was stop for gas. You judged us not by our actions, but by your prejudice, he said firmly. His words echoed not just to the officers, but to the entire crowd. You humiliated me in front of my wife and children, and for what? For buying snacks on vacation? The taller officer swallowed hard, his pride cracking. Sir, we made a mistake. We were just trying to do our job, he muttered. But Mr. Johnson shook his head, his voice steady as stone. No. A mistake is misplacing paperwork. This was not a mistake. This was a choice. You chose suspicion over fairness. You chose power over compassion. The crowd murmured in agreement, their phones capturing every syllable. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, her voice strong now. Our children will remember this day forever. The day they saw their father put in cuffs for nothing. What will that teach them about justice? She asked. Her words cut through the air like a blade. The shorter officer lowered his eyes, unable to answer, his shame visible in every line of his face. Mr. Johnson continued, his voice growing firmer. I have worked for years to protect this country. I've risked my life against real threats, and yet today, in front of my children, I was treated as the threat. How do you explain that? Neither officer spoke, their silence louder than any excuse could be. The weight of truth pressed down on them, exposing the weakness in their authority. The father took one step closer, his eyes locked on theirs. You see a badge on me now, and suddenly your tone changes. Suddenly I deserve respect. But you should know this. You owe every citizen that same respect. Not just the ones with titles, not just the ones with badges. Every single one. His words thundered across the lot, shaking even the bystanders who had only come to buy gas. For many, it was a reminder of how easily fairness could be twisted by prejudice. Maya tugged gently on her mother's arm, whispering, Daddy's teaching them. Mrs. Johnson nodded softly, her heart swelling with both pain and pride, because she knew her children weren't just watching a confrontation, they were watching a lesson, one that would shape how they understood justice and dignity for the rest of their lives. Mr. Johnson's voice softened, but its edge remained. You have children, don't you? He asked, his eyes piercing into the taller officers. The man hesitated, then nodded slowly. Then imagine them watching you be handcuffed for nothing. Imagine the fear in their eyes. Imagine explaining to them why you were treated like that. Do you feel the weight of that? The officer's shoulders slumped, his face pale, his silence an answer of its own. The shorter officer tried to speak, but his voice cracked. We didn't mean harm, sir. Mr. Johnson's jaw tightened, his tone sharp. You didn't mean harm, but you caused harm. Intent does not erase impact. And today your actions left scars. Scars on my children who now know the sound of cuffs before they know the sound of the ocean. Gasps came from the crowd, some shaking their heads, others wiping tears. Mr. Johnson stepped back, placing his hands on his children's shoulders. They will remember this, but they will also remember how we stood tall, how we didn't let fear define us, he said. Then he turned back to the officers one last time. Let this be the day you change. Let this be the day you see beyond your assumptions, because power without fairness is not justice. It is abuse. His words landed like final judgment, leaving no room for argument. The crowd began clapping softly, some murmuring, That's right, others saying, Powerful. The officers stood frozen, faces flushed with shame, knowing the videos already captured everything. They had been exposed not just by a badge, but by the truth spoken plainly, and in that truth lay their greatest lesson, one that would follow them long after the crowd dispersed. Mrs. Johnson gathered her children, holding them close as they walked back to the SUV. Mr. Johnson followed, his dignity intact, his strength shining brighter than before. Though the day had scarred them, it had also given them a story of resilience, a story where injustice tried to break them, but instead, it became the stage for a lesson too powerful to ignore. The gas station lot slowly emptied after the confrontation. Some bystanders left quietly, shaken by what they had seen, while others lingered, Whispering about the truth that had been revealed, the two officers stood stiffly by their cruiser, still pale with shame. Knowing their actions had been captured from every angle by cell phones, their pride was gone. Their authority exposed for what it had become, abuse twisted by prejudice. But for the Johnson family, the moment was no longer about the officers. It was about healing, about gathering their strength after a storm that had nearly broken their day. Mrs. Johnson guided Maya and Jordan back to the SUV. Her arms protective, her heart aching, she opened the door. Helping them inside, her voice gentle. "You're safe now." "Daddy's with us." The children nodded through tears, their small hands clutching the seats as if afraid to let go. Mr. Johnson walked slowly toward them, his shoulders still straight, his presence radiating calm. The red marks from the cuffs burned against his skin, but he wore them like proof of dignity, not defeat. When he reached the car, Maya flung herself into his arms, her sobs soft but steady. "Daddy, I thought they were going to take you away," she whispered, her little voice trembling. He knelt down, holding her tightly. "No one can take me away from you, baby girl, not like that." "Not ever." Jordan stood beside him, his fists still clenched, his young eyes burning with confusion and anger. "They treated you like a bad guy, but you're the good guy. You protect people," he said, his voice shaking. Mr. Johnson rested a hand on his son's shoulder, his voice low but firm. "Sometimes people judge before they know the truth. Sometimes they see what they want instead of what's real. But remember this, what others think does not change who we are." Jordan blinked hard. His small chest rising with determination, Mrs. Johnson stood nearby, her eyes glistening as she watched the bond between father and children grow even stronger. She knew the scars of the day would remain, but she also knew her children had seen something powerful. They had seen injustice, yes, but they had also seen resilience, dignity, and the strength of a man who refused to break. She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around all three of them, her voice steady. "We're together, and that's what matters most. Nothing can take that away from us." The family stayed in that embrace for a long moment, the world around them fading. The gas pumps, the whispering strangers, even the officers, all of it disappeared in the warmth of their unity. Finally, Mr. Johnson stood, guiding his wife and children into the car. As he closed the door, he looked once more at the officers, his eyes steady, his words sharp but calm. "You can strip a man of his freedom for a moment, but you cannot strip him of his dignity. Remember that?" The officers said nothing, their silence heavier than any apology. The badge in Mr. Johnson's wallet had already spoken louder than their authority ever could. He slid into the driver's seat, his hands firm on the wheel, his heart beating with both pain and pride. The SUV rolled out of the lot, the sound of tires on gravel carrying them away from the scene. The road stretched ahead, glowing under the late sun, promising freedom once more inside the car. The atmosphere slowly shifted. The children sat quietly at first, staring out the windows, their minds replaying what they had seen. But soon Jordan spoke, his voice small but curious. "Daddy, will things always be like this?" he asked. Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Not always, son. Change comes slowly, but it comes. And it begins with people like us refusing to let fear define us." Maya leaned forward from the back seat, her voice timid. "Will they get in trouble for what they did to you?" Her father glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes soft but firm. "They'll have to answer for it, baby. Because truth always comes out, just like it did today." The girl nodded, her small shoulders relaxing just a little. The family drove in silence for a while, the ocean's scent growing stronger with every mile. When they finally reached the coastline, the children's eyes lit up despite the heaviness of the day. The waves sparkled under the fading sun. The sand stretched wide and welcoming. Mr. Johnson parked, stepping out to breathe in the salty air. For a moment, he let the sound of the waves wash over him, cleansing away the bitterness of the encounter. The children ran to the edge of the sand, their shoes forgotten, their laughter slowly returning. Mrs. Johnson walked beside her husband, slipping her hand into his. "They tried to break us today," she whispered, her voice steady. "But they didn't," he replied. squeezing her hand gently. "They only made us stronger." As the sun sank lower, painting the water in shades of orange and pink, the Johnson family stood together. They were not just a family on vacation anymore. They were a symbol of resilience. The children would never forget the day their father was cuffed unfairly, but they would also never forget how he stood tall, revealed his truth, and turned pain into power. In that moment, under the endless sky, their bond grew unbreakable, for no prejudice, no injustice, no abuse of power could weaken the love that held them together. And though the scars of the day would remain, so too would the lesson. That strength is not measured by uniforms or handcuffs, but by dignity, courage, and love. And for the Johnson family, that truth would carry them forward stronger than before.